no matter.
Hey everyone, today we're jumping into one of the hottest topics in election reform, ranked choice voting. We're going to be looking specifically at the case against it using a report called A Threat to Our Electoral Process as our guide. Now, our job here isn't to pick a side, but to really understand the arguments this report is making, using its own data and its own research. So let's get right into it. All right, here's our game plan. First up, we're going to get a quick handle on how ranked choice voting, or RCV, actually works. Then, we'll dive into the real meat of the report's critique, and we'll break that down into three main areas: the impact on you, the voter, the integrity of the system as a whole, and finally, what the report says about the actual election outcomes. So, let's start with the absolute basics. Before we can really break down the arguments against RCV, we all need to be on the same page about what it is and how this whole thing operates. At its heart, RCV is a system where you don't just pick one favorite candidate. Instead, you rank them. This is my first choice, my second choice, my third, and so on. Now, the real magic, or maybe the real complication, depending on your point of view, happens in how the votes are counted. And that process is usually handled by something called instant runoff voting, or IRV. So how does the vote counting actually play out? Okay, step one, everyone's first choice votes get tallied up. If somebody gets more than 50% right off the bat, boom, election's over, they win. Simple. But if no one hits that magic number, the candidate in last place gets eliminated. And here's the crucial part. Their votes aren't just tossed out. Nope, they get transferred to whoever those voters picked as their second choice. And that process just repeats: eliminate, reallocate, recount, over and over, until one candidate finally has a majority of the votes that are still in play. Okay, so now that we've got the mechanics down, let's get into the report's first big argument. And it's aimed squarely at the experience of the individual voter. The central claim here is that RCV, far from making things better, actually makes voting more confusing and can end up suppressing turnout and even disenfranchising certain communities. And this quote, right from the report's summary, really lays their argument out on the table. The claim is that RCV, whatever its good intentions might be, actually creates new obstacles for voters. So let's take a look at the evidence they use to try and back that up. To make its case, the report points to a study of mayoral elections in San Francisco. And what it found was that after RCV was put in place, turnout dropped across the board. But, as you can see, the study found the decline was even steeper for Black voters, a full 18% drop compared to 16% for white voters. The report presents this as clear evidence that RCV has a disproportionate and negative impact. And that brings us to the issue of what the report calls discarded votes. It focuses on two main problems. The first is just simple mistakes, people marking their ballots incorrectly. The second is a concept called ballot exhaustion. That's what happens when all of the candidates you ranked get eliminated before the final round. Your ballot essentially runs out of road and doesn't count in that final tally. And the report makes a really startling claim. When you add up the ballots tossed for errors and these exhausted ballots, it argues that more than a quarter of voters could end up having no say at all in the final result. Now, the report's critique doesn't stop with the voter. It also takes aim at the integrity of the voting system itself, raising some pretty big flags about security, our ability to audit the results, and, of course, the cost. Wow. Okay, this is a really serious charge. The report is citing a 2024 study from MIT researchers who say the ranking system itself creates a major security flaw. Here's the idea. Because there are so many unique ways to rank a slate of candidates, a voter could, in theory, be paid to rank them in a specific, unique order, a fingerprint, that a vote buyer could then verify in the public voting data. And that, they argue, could totally compromise the principle of a secret ballot. Next up is accountability. And this is a big one. The report argues that in a traditional election, a recount is pretty simple, right? You just count the ballots again, by hand if you need to. But with RCV, the report says a full manual hand recount is basically impossible. You'd have to physically resort and rerun every single round of elimination by hand. So instead, you have to rely on complex computer algorithms, which the report claims makes the whole process way less transparent and harder for the average person to trust. The report also points to a pretty clear national trend as evidence of growing pushback. I mean, look at this. In just 3 years, 17 states have passed laws to outright ban RCV. What's more, the report highlights a really critical distinction here. It says that no state legislature has ever passed RCV into law. The places that have it, like Alaska and Maine, got it because voters passed it directly through ballot initiatives. But when that very same question was put to voters in 6 other states in 2024, it was shot down every single time. All right, this brings us to the final piece of the report's argument, the actual results. The critique here is that RCV fails to deliver on 2 of its biggest promises. One, that it produces consensus winners with true majority support, and 2, that it helps reduce political polarization. So this gets to a really crucial point. How do you actually define a majority? See, RCV guarantees the winner gets over 50% of the votes left in the final round. But the report points to a Cornell study that asked a different question. Did the winner get a majority of all the votes that were cast in the very first round? And what that study found was that in 52% of the RCV elections they looked at, the answer was no. The winner, in fact, didn't have the support of a majority of the total pool of voters.
And what about cooling down the political temperature? You know, you often hear that RCV forces candidates to be less extreme to get those second and third choice votes. But this report highlights research from the University of Illinois Law Review that suggests the opposite could be true. Their analysis found the RCV might actually produce winners who are more ideologically extreme, further away from the average voter, especially in states that are already pretty polarized.
Okay, so let's pull all this together. When you boil it all down, what are the core arguments that the report, a threat to our electoral process, is making against ranked choice voting? Okay, let's recap. First, from the voter's perspective, the source claims the system's complexity leads to lower turnout and way more discarded ballots. Second, on a bigger, systemic level, it raises these huge alarms about potential threats to ballot secrecy and the near impossibility of doing a simple, transparent recount. And finally, when it comes to the outcomes, it claims that winners often don't have a true majority, and that the system, counterintuitively, might even make our politics more polarized, not less. You know, at the end of the day, all the arguments laid out in this report force us to face this really fundamental challenge in a democracy. As we're looking for new and better ways to run our elections, how do we balance that desire to innovate with the things that are just non-negotiable, like security, fairness, simplicity, and most of all, the public's absolute trust in the final result? It's a huge question, and understanding all sides of this debate is the first and most important step.